We will begin the process in just a few moments, so stand by.
Okay.
And why don't we begin right now? Good afternoon, everyone. This is, again, Edward Jones, Director of Programs for ABFE, a philanthropic partnership for Black communities. And on behalf of ABFE staff, board, leadership, that we wanted to just thank you all for joining this very important conversation as part of our ongoing Third Thursday webinar series. This one titled Blackout, Understanding LGBT Advocacy and Black Communities. Again, it's a very timely conversation, and we have a great group of folks who are going to help enlighten and share information around this topic. In addition to that, we're going to invite you all to understand a few ground rules. First of all, the phones are going to be muted throughout the call and during the webinar, so we can avoid any outside noises and distractions and such. But throughout the process, we're going to invite you to use the chat box on the right side of your screen, or it should be on the right side of your screen, that will allow you to pose questions. So you can do that throughout the process, but we'll reach a particular time during the webinar in which we will actually pose those questions, and so stay tuned for that. But again, you can start posing the questions and typing those into the chat box at any time during the program. Next slide. Again, you see who I am, but one of the most important people of this call is our colleague who is helping and has been a great partner from the Schaumburg, Alvin Starks, who is going to moderate this call. We want you to reach out and communicate as well. So join the conversation, keep the conversation alive by using the following hashtags or the ABFE handle that you see there on the screen. Take it away, Alvin.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am extremely excited to be a part of this conversation, both from the standpoint of being at the Schaumburg Center, but also from my previous life as a funder. I know that these issues are sometimes complex, but they also hold a lot of opportunity. This afternoon, we have a stellar cast of characters from the philanthropic sector who I think will not only enlighten, but also provide really important information around the intersections of race and LGBTQI activism. What I would like to do to begin the conversation is maybe give us a bit of an agenda. First and foremost, we see these conversations in four interdependent parts. The first part is what we're experiencing now, the welcome and the overview. The second part will be our illustrious webinar presentations from our featured panelists, and then we'll have time for a Q&A with the panel. We definitely have heard that people are really interested and inspired to engage with the panel, so we want to create enough sufficient time for dialogue. And as Edward shared with us, it's really important to put in your questions in the chat box to the right of your screen. Our colleague Bianca Alston from ABFE will give us a chance to really review those and then tell us the questions that have come up. And then last but not least, we'll do some closing comments. I think this really provides an opportunity to really think about the next steps, but also where this conversation should go. Next slide. You know, as we were thinking about this conversation, we wanted to give it a flashpoint, if you will. Many of us have always been inspired by the work of activist, poet, scholar Audre Lorde, and she really left us a lot to think about. And one of those issues that I think is so eloquent is that there is no hierarchy of oppressions. Though this was written maybe 30 or 40 years ago, I think it's still as relevant today as it was then. And just to quote her, she says something very profound. Within the lesbian community, I am black, and within the black community, I am a lesbian. Any attack against black people is a lesbian and gay issue. Because I and thousands of other black women are part of the lesbian community, any attack against lesbians and blacks is a black issue. Because thousands of lesbian and gay men are black. There is no hierarchy of oppression. I think this is really key and significant, next slide, for us to kind of have in our mindset. This is a picture of Audre Lorde, in case you didn't know. Next slide. This is not brand new, though. LGBTQ communities have always existed within the racial justice and LGBTQ activism field. The picture that you see here, as many of you know, is Bayard Rustin, who is both advisor to SNCC as well as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself, but also the great architect of the March on Washington. And I think it's a really good moment to kind of understand how these spaces, these identities, these leaderships, these issues really do coexist. We know that these continued invisibilities are oftentimes due to the voices because of homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, and racism. Yet there is such a profound legacy of heroes and sheroes within the Black LGBT community. Next slide. What's great about this particular moment is that today issues of racial justice and LGBTQ rights are at the forefront of the American consciousness. These are issues that you can see probably more readily available than ever before. But the landscape continues to change, right? So if we were to look at where the Supreme Court is on issues of race, they lean one way, and then they lean another way around LGBTQI identities. We also know that through the great work of the Black Lives Matter movement, voter suppression, growing interest around addressing inequalities within wages and criminal justice, these are all significant moments that actually highlight a structural racism lens. What we also know, which I think is even more interesting but also important to this conversation, is that many of the leaders in these movements are also LGBTQI identified. But there's been some disability to actually create a collective interest in explicitly addressing LGBTQI issues. Next slide. On the reverse side of things, we do see a growing interest and philanthropic support around LGBT equality issues, not just within the framework of marriage equality, but also legal rights. And we do see a growing pop culture sensibility around these issues. But it would be wrong for us to kind of see that there's a panacea of success. We know that there's still continued discrimination. Now, underneath that, we know that Black LGBT communities are oftentimes at a very unique space. So the discriminations experienced there actually exist both in home, faith institutions, schools, workplace, health facilities, and communities. So these intersections are actually operating both in race, gender expression, and sexuality, but they're also within public policy in our everyday society. Next slide. So what we want to do with this conversation is really figure out what are the constructive roles that funders can play to really address these concerns. How do we collectively build and explicitly understand the work of LGBT activism as part of a larger social justice, human rights paradigm? We hope this conversation is provocative, and I think it will be. We have also had the fortune of actually having this conversation hosted by two strong organizations, one being the Funders for LGBTQ Issues, as well as the Third Wave Foundation. I'm sorry, the Third Wave Fund. We hope that we will be able to kind of examine leadership. We hope that we'll be able to kind of talk about issues, but also organizations, and actually connecting the dots between race and LGBTQ issues. Next slide. So I want to introduce our featured panel, and many of you probably know everyone on this list, so that's going to be exciting. First, we'll have Roz Lee, the Director of Social Justice Initiatives at the Arcus Foundation, followed by Gabriel Foster, Co-founder and Director of Trans Justice Funding Project, then Na Hammond, from Research and Associates, Communications Associate at Funder for LGBTQ Issues, and then followed by Ernest Hopkins, the Director of Legislative Affairs at the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome Roz Lee to the conversation. Roz, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Take it away, Roz.
That's good news, because I had some technical difficulties on my end. Good day, everyone, and I am very pleased and excited to be a part of this webinar. In addition to working at the Arcus Foundation, I also have the pleasure of being a board member of ABFE, and so I'm wearing that hat as well today. And just as the first person presenting on the webinar, I also just really want to give a head nod to my colleagues, my other colleagues who are also going to be sharing information, and greetings to everyone who I'm sure will have questions and ideas of their own. So just very briefly, Arcus's mission, we're dedicated to the idea that people can live in harmony with each other and the natural world. We have a social justice and conservation focus. And our social justice focus is specifically on LGBT equality, and within that we have a specific programmatic focus on communities of color and young people. And Alvin asked me to approach a few different questions in thinking about today's discussion, and where I would start is how does Arcus's grant making specifically address issues impacting Black LGBT communities, and within that, as a philanthropic organization, are there measurable goals that we try to achieve? First and foremost, you're seeing the slide of a report that Arcus partnered with the Center for American Progress on, Jumping Beyond the Broom, Why Black, Gay, and Transgender Americans Need More Than Marriage Equality. We see a core part of our contributing resource to the field is a core part of our approach is demystifying issues impacting Black LGBT communities, and helping to answer the question, what is beyond marriage? What more beyond marriage concerns Black LGBT communities? And what we do know, and this report lifts up, is that Black LGBT communities trend to being even more disproportionately impacted by the core social justice issues that all Black Americans face, all African Americans face. Economic insecurity and opportunity, low educational attainment, health and wellness disparities. That these are issues that regardless of your sexual orientation or gender identity, are impacting our communities, and sometimes more deeply so when you do factor in gender identity and sexual orientation. Our measurable goals toward that end, we see progress when the school-to-prison pipeline is being addressed, including eliminating harmful school discipline policies that disproportionately impact LGBT youth of color, addressing homelessness. Over 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ, and many of them are youth of color. So where are the opportunities within Black social justice issues to engage a diverse set of funders? And that's that, and if we could go to the next slide. So where are those opportunities? Well, me and my colleagues here at Arcus on our social justice team have been heavily influenced by the work of many scholars, but particularly the scholarship of the Black feminist legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, and breaks it down all the time for anybody to be able to understand. But in the essence of it, what it means and how we approach our program work and our grant making is recognizing that multiple identities combine or intersect to create both complex problems and the need to support complex solutions to those problems. So an example would be a partnership between the Arcus Foundation, the NAACP, Streetwise and Safe, which is an LGBTQ queer youth-led organization here in New York City, and other grassroots LGBT groups of color, including groups that specifically are engaging Black communities around the world, around the country, to examine stop and frisk policies and racial profiling policies around the country. And the significance of being able to support work and dialogue and policy interventions of this kind is the acknowledgement that within the broader Black community, that our community is diverse, and within that community there are also LGBTQ Black Americans, and that their needs and the solutions to their problems also need to be addressed by our entire community. Another example that I would give very quickly is one of our grantee partners, the Black Youth Project 100, which is a diverse group of 18 to 35-year-old activists from all around the nation addressing issues impacting Black communities. That organization is unapologetic about using a Black queer feminist lens in identifying advocacy and organizing opportunities and solutions to our community's problems. And then lastly, I would use the example of Black Lives Matter, which other people may talk about later, but a movement where the hashtag itself, but also the movement was sparked by the leadership of Black queer women. And so we look to be able to support, and we can go to the next slide, diverse leaders identifying tried and true approaches to solving community problems, but then also innovative approaches to solving those problems, and recognizing that across multiple movements, we're seeing the leadership of Black LGBTQ people. And then to approach the question and then wrap up my remarks around what would be my recommendations for my fellow funders in supporting Black LGBT communities. I've lifted up a few different examples where we've supported scholarship, resource, demystifying what the policy issues are, demystifying what the cultural change opportunities might be. So we tremendously value the knowledge building, the learning and sharing opportunities, putting real facts and information out there, and then lifting up and making more visible the work of people who are leading campaigns and winning for their constituencies. And that can't only take, but it can not only take the form of what's in writing or what you can put in a PowerPoint, but that we are also supporting innovative ways to tell stories, lift up narratives through film, through media, through blogging. One of my favorite grants, may not necessarily supposed to have favorite grants, but I have a few, is to Black Girl Dangerous, and one of the reasons I like that grant so much is because the audience is so broad, yet the scholarship is coming from, primarily coming from queer identified folks. The other specific recommendation I would make, or at least food for thought that I would put on the table, is understanding the implications of not addressing injustice everywhere and not including all Black people in our quest for justice, equality, and freedom. And I'll bring up a recent example when just a couple of weeks ago in Houston, the city of Houston, an ordinance called HERO, which was a non-discrimination ordinance that would have increased protections for 19 different groups of people, 19 different categories, constituencies. It would have increased protections, and yet transphobia, and transphobic sentiment denied benefits for all of those people. And those people included all kinds of Black people. And so I think that the implications for funders in not integrating the issues or the analysis of how these issues are impacting Black LGBT constituencies and into the long-term solutions and the long-term social change that's needed in this country is something that is not only a disservice to those communities, but it's a disservice to our entire community. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Roz. You left us with, I think, a very important and significant groundwork to have this conversation. And so I'm going to invite everyone to, again, consider writing up questions that you have into the right chat box. I know I have several to follow up with Roz on, so I'm looking forward to the conversation. Our next presenter is Gabriel Foster, and Gabriel is the co-founder and director of the Trans Justice Funding Project. Gabriel, are you there?
I'm here.
Perfect. Gabriel, take it away.
Okay, I'm on. Thank you so much, Alvin, and thanks, Ross, for going first. That was like a great way for me to follow. I just want to say thank you, everyone, for this opportunity to webinar with you all. As a Black trans person and a 2016 ABFE Connecting Leadership Fellow class member, I'm really, really thrilled to be here today talking with you all. This is my first webinar, so I can't see who's leaning in or falling asleep, but I'm just going to trust that you all are out there maybe nodding your heads, saying a few mm-hms, and forming questions. So before I just want to, as I dive in, I just want to tell you a little bit about who the Trans Justice Funding Project is and what we do. And then I'd like to share some thinking, some information, thoughts that I've been having lately that will hopefully be useful and or provide kind of like a jump-off point for further conversation. So the Trans Justice Funding Project is a community-led funding initiative that was founded in 2012 by myself and Karen Pittleman to support grassroots trans justice groups run by and for trans people. We make grants annually by bringing together a panel of 6 trans justice activists from around the country to review each and every application we receive and to select grantees and the award amounts. We're a 2-staff operation that has worked with about 18 community organizers and activists on our rotating grant-making panel, who are a majority people of color, trans and gender nonconforming folks who represent a wide range of experiences, identities, geographic locations, and ages. So over the last 3 years, we've received 354 applications and have given away funding to 177 small groups totaling $400,000. So that's, maybe it doesn't sound like a lot of money in comparison to other groups, but just keep in mind the folks that we make grants to, they have budgets of $250,000 and under. So some of them have budgets of literally zero. This work has been possible because of hundreds of donors who have joined us and become our communities, and the communities that have supported us in so many ways. And each and every penny that we raise through our grassroots fundraising goes to the grantees with no restrictions and no strings attached because we believe in trans leadership, and that's how we choose to show it. So if you could go to the next slide, please. I provided some slides, but I really just kind of want to talk a little bit more. When I say that we fund trans justice work in the U.S., I want to break that down a little bit. What I mean by that is that we center the leadership of trans people who are organizing around their issues and experiences with racism, economic injustice, trans misogyny, ableism, immigration, incarceration, and other intersecting oppressions. So for those of you who don't know, on November 20th, trans communities and allies, I think like worldwide, hold events and visuals for the Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is also known as TDOR. TDOR is an annual observance that honors the memory of those whose lives were lost in acts of anti-transgender violence. And so last night I was at a TDOR event put on by the Audre Lorde Project here in New York. One of the organizers was speaking, a black trans woman, speaking to a packed church, and she said, "The tipping point is not exciting, it's spilling over." And as she said that, I feel like I could have taken what she said in several different ways, but I think what was happening is that her words touched on something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. For the last couple of years, we've seen some pretty major shifts in media representation and acknowledgement of trans people. You know, there are some success stories, as I will put it, like Laverne Cox, ever wonderful Janet Mock, and even Caitlyn Jenner. And while those, like having them be so visible and being able to speak about different needs and issues for trans communities, at the same time, they simply do not and cannot represent an entire community. I think a lot of us on this call might also be able to identify with that. So while they have been, especially Janet and Laverne, have dedicated so much love and so much commitment to lifting up the community need and voices alongside them, you know, I'd be remiss in not saying that the majority of the trans people that I have worked with and for, especially black trans community members, are not on magazine covers. We're not always invited to speak at colleges around the country, and our voices are not always amplified. Some of them have been excluded. Some of our community members have been excluded from their birth families and unable to continue obtaining an education. For many of us, schools are not exactly what any of us would call a safe haven. If you don't have access to your birth family and your school becomes a site for potentially endless harassment, you just want to pose the question, like, what do you think that might mean, or how do you think that might not help you be able to access a job or employment? Some of us have severely limited employment options and are constantly targeted and criminalized by the police, and a lot of us are likely to end up in jail or prison. So I also want to ask people who might not identify with this to also imagine what it might feel like to be a trans person in a prison or jail cell, isolated with little or no support of any kind. If you're lucky enough to be released, it's highly likely that you might find yourself trying to check yourself into a homeless shelter only to be turned away because of transphobia. Trans and gender nonconforming people of color are disproportionately impacted by physical and structural violence. So this, too, isn't the story of each and every trans person. We all have different experiences and different stories, but unfortunately, I would say from the work that I've done over the past several years, this is a pretty unfortunate common story. In the Trans Justice Funding Project's first report, our funding panel facilitator, Nico Amador, wrote an article. I just want to share a piece of what he wrote. The article is called "A Growing Movement for Trans Justice." So Nico writes, "Most social justice movements don't take off and transform the culture overnight. To achieve the kind of profile we associate with historic actions, such as the Montgomery bus boycott in the 1950s, ACT UP's confrontational tactics during the AIDS crisis, or even recent activism in support of gay marriage, social movements often go through quieter stages of development that lay the groundwork for victories to come. The movement for trans justice is in the stage that happens right before a movement takes off, a stage of ripening conditions. If the work that is happening right now continues to thrive, more groups will be poised to collaborate on campaigns and use bolder tactics that address root causes of many issues and allow us to exercise our collective power as a community." So before I close out, I just want to ask you, dear audience, who I can't see, for a favor. I just want to, if you didn't hear anything else or you weren't paying attention to anything else, I just want to ask you to really listen to this part. This is what I would like you to be able to carry away from this. I just want to insert my own personal thoughts and thinking and say that blackness and transness is a terrifying combination to many people. That feels like the reality. Our bodies are feared and criminalized each and every day. In addition to not being able to access our most basic human rights, education, housing, medical care, employment, etc. People are killing us at rampant rates. Since January 2015, I believe the murder count is up to 22 or 23 trans people who have been murdered simply for being trans. And these are just the cases that have been reported and the names that we know, most of them being Black and Latina trans women. As my trans sisters have said repeatedly, this is a state of emergency. I cannot stress to you enough that trans communities are fighting daily, literally for our very lives. And I'm not sure how many of you out there can relate, but on the other side of that, I feel like there's an undeniable energy in the air right now. The Black Lives Matter movement and the trans justice movement seem to be growing stronger and stronger by the day, and the momentum is increasing, and the leadership is increasing. And I just feel like what a time to be deeply engaged in this work for all of us. So as I wrap up, one of our 2015 grantees shared in an article a couple of years ago about being Black and trans, Sasha Alexander says, I realized no one was going to give me permission to do the work I felt called to do, to confront the intersections of racism, transphobia, in a culturally Black way. So I started to do it myself. I love this quote because I also truly believe that we have an opportunity to give ourselves permission to answer the call of our people, or to answer the calls of ourselves. And I would also just like to say that as Black people, I think that a lot of us, most of us, all of us share a history of being colonized and separated from each other. And personally, I've become more and more interested in finding ways to resist this. And I hope that through conversations like this, we can also find ways to break down some of the barriers that separate us. And as we used to say at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, where I used to work with trans people who are incarcerated, we often wrote, with you, not without you. So thank you.
Gabriel, that was simply brilliant. You probably can't see, and none of us can actually see the response, but I'm sure all would agree on the phone that you gave a very, very stellar presentation, and great job, and I'm glad this was your first webinar that we had a chance to really experience that. Again, I think you really laid some very concrete examples around the questions of intersections and where opportunities exist. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A with you and the other presenters, but also I want to invite everyone to write in their questions in the chat box to the right. Next for this conversation, I want to bring in Na Hammond, who is the Research and Communications Associate at Funders for LGBTQ Issues. Na, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Please take it away.
Great. Well, thank you, Alvin, and thank you, everyone at ABFE, and to my co-presenters as well. It's wonderful always to hear the stories of the work that our members are doing because it's so inspiring and also urgent and timely. So again, I'm from Funders for LGBTQ Issues, and for those of you who don't know, we are a network of foundations who are committed to increasing funding for LGBT communities. And it's really my pleasure to join this conversation today about a topic that's personally near and dear to my heart as a young Black queer person working in philanthropy. And really was very excited to see that ABFE was holding this conversation. Both of our networks have been working for many decades to make philanthropy more responsive to our communities. And it's a shame that oftentimes we don't have enough of these spaces to really have discussions about the many similar challenges that Black people and LGBT people are facing in this country, including a lack of economic opportunity, severe health disparities, and issues of violence, policing, and over-incarceration. And as a result, very often, the communities that are left out are the communities that fall in the intersections. So Black, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer communities. So today I'll be presenting a little bit of an overview of what we're seeing currently in philanthropy for Black LGBT communities and where we see trends, gaps, and potential opportunities for funders. Next slide, please. So this chart on the screen overviews grant making that we saw in 2013. This data is from the Foundation Center and from our own research at Funders for LGBTQ Issues. So the chart shows foundation funding overall in the U.S. was about $55 billion in 2013. About 10% of that was for people of color. So the green is foundation funding overall. The blue is foundation funding for people of color. And then when we looked at our own analysis of what the funding levels were for LGBT communities, we saw that LGBT communities received only about $129 million. And to put that in other words, that means that for every $100 that foundations give away, LGBT communities see only about 24 cents. And when we try to zoom in even further and try to get a very close slice of what funding looks like for Black LGBT communities, you can see that that doesn't even show up on the chart. It was about $5 million last year, which was a huge increase from the year before as well. Next slide, please. So I wanted to take a second to sort of zoom out and think about who we're talking about when we're talking about Black LGBT communities. And this chart is data that we received from the Williams Institute at UCLA. And there are about 8 million LGBT people in the US, and when we look at race, we see that a higher percentage of Black people self-identify as LGBTQ than other races and ethnicities. So Black people are also disproportionately more likely to be young people and more likely to be female. There is a study that shows about 60% of Black LGBT people are women. Next slide, please. And when we look at the impact of really these communities living at the intersections of racism, transphobia, biphobia, and homophobia, what we see is that Black LGBT people are facing significant disparities. I have a couple on the screen right now to show you, but there is a lot more research that is out there. On the issue of criminalization, each year about 300,000 gay and transgender youth are arrested and detained. And to put that in context, that's about the population of Cincinnati, Ohio. And of these youth, the majority, about 60%, are Black and Latino. And those studies are obviously with youth who are comfortable self-identifying as LGBT in the survey, so this might be an underestimate. And homelessness, as Roz mentioned, even though LGBT youth make up only about 5% of the youth population, homeless LGBT youth make up about 40% of the homeless youth population. And also, similarly, a national study of transgender people in the country found that 41% of Black trans people reported having been homeless in one time of their life. Next slide. So I thought today it might be helpful to share a little bit about the funding trends and where we see the money going for Black LGBT communities of the $5 million that's given annually. And this chart shows general funding overall, which is in the green, LGBT philanthropic dollars, which is in the maroon, and funding for Black LGBT communities. And these are the percentages. So we see that the majority of funding for Black LGBT communities goes to civil rights, which will include advocacy and community organizing, and then work to strengthen communities, families, and increase the visibility of our communities. And primarily, that's being done by grassroots community groups that are working in straight and faith-based Black communities to foster welcoming and affirming families and societies. The third highest category was health. We can see that for health, there's a higher percentage of funding for Black LGBT communities. But when we looked at the data, about 97% of that funding was for HIV and AIDS, targeting gay and bisexual Black men. And this is an important area. We're going to hear a little bit about disparities facing Black, gay, and bisexual men in Black communities overall. And a lot of HIV funders have started to increase their investment in this underserved community. And while it's so important, we also know that there are other issues, health issues facing LGBT communities. In particular, LGBT communities are much less likely to have health insurance than non-LGBT people. and then also are less likely to find culturally and clinically competent healthcare as well. The last three categories on this slide, economic issues, education, and other, when we looked at the data to try to see what was happening in funding for Black LGBT communities, there actually wasn't very much funding at all. Economic opportunities, as was mentioned before by my previous panelists, is a particularly important issue for Black LGBT people because we face a lack of legal protections in employment, housing, and healthcare. We're seeing much higher rates of poverty in Black communities, LGBT communities, where about 15% of Black LGBT people are unemployed compared to about 12% of the general population in one study. And so the issues of economic opportunity, education, and other issues such as anti-violence and other issues as well are real areas of interest if there are funders who want to increase their investment in those areas. Next slide, please. So I want to end with thinking about what we can do as people to be more, in philanthropy, to be more responsive to Black LGBT communities. And we have this sheet here, which is broken down into 3 steps, which are helpful for steps for anyone thinking about increasing investment. The first one is looking within to your own foundation. A lot of funders find it helpful to seek more knowledge, to have trainings for staff, and find out how issues that are impacting Black LGBT communities intersect with your own core priorities as a funder. Also thinking about being welcoming and creating a welcoming environment within your own foundation for the staff who work there, which may include ensuring that there are employment non-discrimination, protections that cover sexual orientation and gender identity and expression, doing data collection of your own, and having an ongoing conversation within the foundation talking about the commitment to racial equity and justice and LGBT rights as well. Another easy area that a lot of foundations reach out to funders for LGBTQ issues to help with is making sure that they're doing inclusive outreach within their own grant making. So asking their current grantees for demographic data and how they're serving LGBT communities and Black communities. And then also thinking about reaching out to eligible groups that match your priorities to be able to send them your request for proposals. And what we say is that many grant makers who are supporting people in general and organizations that work with people are supporting LGBT people. It's just a question of whether that support is intentional and thoughtful and really targeting the unique needs that are being faced by Black LGBT communities or whether it's incidental. And lastly, working with partners. We've heard today from 2 amazing leading funders in the field, but there are many other funders who've been thinking about racial justice, LGBT rights and justice, and thinking about how to work and fund at the intersections and think about funding more broadly to strategically impact the communities that they're funding. And there are many funders that we can share with you, funders who are private funders, community foundations, funders focused on the South where there are a lot of LGBT people, and HIV funders who are really thinking about Black LGBT communities. And lastly, I would welcome anyone on this call to please reach out to Funders for LGBTQ Issues and to ABFE for any advice and assistance we can give you in best meeting the needs of Black LGBT people within the funding areas that you're currently supporting already. Thank you.
No, that was excellent. And in particular, I really appreciate the fact that you were able to give us very sobering statistics about where we are as a movement when it comes to resources and issues. I do want to, can we go back a slide? I do want to bring in another presenter. We have Ernest Hopkins, who is the Director of Legislative Affairs with the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. I know his name is well known both within the DC area for his groundbreaking work there and now, of course, in San Francisco. Ernest, are you there? Can you hear me? Can you unmute your button? So it looks like we're experiencing some slight technical difficulties, but nonetheless, I do want to bring the panel back to open up a conversation, if you will, or a review of what was shared. I took several notes. My first question, hopefully Ernest can join us in a few, my first question is really around how do you identify and support new leadership and innovative partnerships? As a funder, also as a networking group, I'm always curious to really hear how people identify work that's actually emerging from the grassroots, but also the grass tops. Because what you were explaining were a number of issues that almost fit in cross-movement categories. You brought up the issue of criminal justice, you brought up the issue of housing and homelessness, the issue of economic security. So my question is, how do you identify organizations and leadership that are coming to the space with an intersectional lens? Roz, can you start us off in this conversation?
Sure, Alvin. Just a really quick thing that I left out of my presentation. Two things. One is I do want to be also very out in that I identify as a Black, lesbian, queer woman, and I appreciate that everybody else said that. So I want to share that. And then also I'm privileged talking about some of the knowledge building work that we support, but we also directly support organizations with sometimes project support, but also general support. And we try to have a long view around what social change looks like. And so those tend not to be just one-time grants, but a continuing relationship. In response to your question, Alvin, we as a foundation, and I think Gabriel and Na may be able to share different perspectives, but working at a global foundation, we are able to really have a very wide view of what's happening and the connections between issues and communities, from the global South to the U.S. South. And so that really aids us in really having a long-term vision for supporting Black LGBT communities. The other thing that I think is true is that in addition to strategic grant making, our framework includes the ability to convene people, so to be able to put resources out into the field that are about giving space and time for people to think, engage with each other, network. We directly fund various leadership programs, and our support for those programs is usually very specifically to provide those leadership opportunities to LGBTQ people of color in general, and we have also made specific grants to include leadership opportunities for the trans community. And so we tend not to fund leadership and learning opportunities in a broad sense, but ask for our dollars to be targeted toward those constituencies, including young people. And then we in our budgets for our work, we include dollars for listening and learning. And many of us on our social justice team come from an organizing background, and so we build that into how we work. We are very accessible, even with large workloads. We attend a reasonable amount of conferences. I can't tell you I go to every conference, but we go to a lot of conferences, and we put ourselves in a lot of spaces where really our job is just to listen, not to offer up solutions, not to offer up ideas, but to build relationships, listen, and to show up often. because it's not enough to enter a space one time, but to really, if you're really going to be a real partner in the work, to make yourself known and be seen early and often. And so it's really introduced us to a broad community of people, and that community continues to grow because we continue to invest in the listening and learning.
Gabriel, can you share a little bit about the work that you guys do to really support innovative leadership and cross-partnerships from a grant-making perspective?
Sure. Like I mentioned earlier, we work with, each year, 6 activists. Community activists are selected to be part of our grant-making, community-led grant-making team, which is probably one of my favorite parts of my work, is that I get to invite people to make funding decisions, and pretty much, most of them have never been asked to the table, and I do mean the table, to talk about, grant making. And I feel like it's like a leadership it's like more than the money, right? There's a leadership development component that happens. I think it's also like helps to break down isolation, especially for activists who are scattered around the country, sometimes doing work kind of in a silo or not necessarily feeling connected. So it's kind of this like beautiful moment that happens when we bring them to New York to review, talk about the applications and to make the grants. But it's also, it's a really difficult process, right? Like a lot of the folks that are coming to do this have never had these kind of gatekeeper, if you will, roles. They don't clock out at the end of the day. Like this is their everyday life, and they're also helping to fund some of their peers or, other people doing work that is also as equally meaningful for them. So, in addition, so they go through a process, and they go through a process with each other, and because we don't have that opportunity very often, and there's always a group of people who have never worked together. And we also have to do a lot of unlearning, right? As we review the applications, we're not looking for all the dotted I's and crossed T's. Like a lot of our community members haven't always had access to the same kinds of education, but it doesn't mean that what they're writing isn't as important or valuable. We ask them to speak from the heart, and we ask the grant-making team to really read with generosity, right? Like we're not trying to work with scarcity. We're trying to come from an approach of generosity. So there's also a bit of unlearning too about like what qualifies as, it doesn't always have to be the most professional application in the stack. Like it could be the group that meets often and has no resources, and we want to make sure that they are rewarded as well. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I also wanted to say that, like Roz said too, like we also want to value the work of the people. They're taking time away from their lives to review 100+ applications and to show up in New York for a weekend and do some really hard work. So we also make sure that we pay them too. Not a form of constant employment, but it is a job. And the final thing I'll say is, we are also have been tabling at a lot of conferences, and I would strongly suggest that even if it's attending a conference that you might be interested in, just to meet and listen and learn from folks. And I love, again, Roz, what you said about showing up often, developing those relationships as someone who comes out to things, and not always having to offer solutions, but really listening. But the other thing that we're trying to do is to go to places where we've never received an application before. So tomorrow I'm going to Montana, where we've made a few grants there, but want to really provide a face to what we do, and sit down with people and take them out to lunch and just listen to what's going on in their area. And we're also traveling to South Dakota because we've never received an application from South Dakota, but there are like 3 trans leaders, and I found them, but we want to make sure that the areas that are kind of often seen off the radar are also being included. So not just the urban hubs in the Northeast or California, but making sure the groups in other parts of the country are being listened to and heard from as well.
Gabriel, thank you for sharing that. I just want to also share something that came across our wire from someone on a participant, and they say, thank you, Gabriel, for sharing the stories and the impact of Black and Latina trans women. So again, please know that your words matter in this conversation. Na, I had a different set of questions for you, and I wonder if you can actually say a little bit more about, the funding. Using the intersectional lens that Roz shared via Kimberly Crenshaw, we know that the majority of Black people actually live in the South. And I know that funders just recently did a report focusing on the South. So I'm wondering, does that open up more opportunities to really support Black LGBTQ issues? And then my second question for you is, and I hope you can answer this as well, is there ever, from your vantage point, I would say a tipping point or an opportunity that kind of people get that Black LGBT communities are out there, and how do we really move the needle from the current 5 million to even more resources? So I hope that's not too much to ask, but I would love to hear your thoughts on those two issues, the intersections of region when it comes to funding and Black communities in the South, but also where you see opportunities to really move the needle up to more funding from the current 5 million space.
Thanks, Alvin. Those are great questions. And maybe Roz, as one of the longtime leaders in the Out in the South network, can chime in as well. But absolutely, to your question about thinking about intersections in the South is home to more Black people in the country than any other region. Similarly, when we look at demographic data, about 3 out of 10 LGBT people live in the U.S. South, which is more than any other region in the country. And they're more likely to be people of color, more likely to be low income, and more likely to be raising children. So certainly there is a lot of crossover and interest for funders who are interested in supporting the U.S. South and work moving forward there, and racial equity and justice, and also funders who are interested in supporting LGBT rights and justice as well in the South. And our Out in the South network really came from our membership being very excited about having a deeper and intentional conversation about increasing funding to the U.S. South, because it was, even though there are more LGBT people in the U.S. South, it is actually the lowest funded region when we look at all the regions around LGBT funding. And so for many years, a couple of years, the funders have been working together to really increase investment and interest in the U.S. South. We've released 2 reports, 3 reports actually last week. Our latest one is called Out in the South Part 3, pardon me, which is thinking about opportunities for funders who are thinking about funding in the South but want to know more. And it's broken down by issue area, funders who are interested in economic opportunity and insecurity, funders interested in arts or culture, civil rights and policy, social justice. There are many different opportunities and ways for funders to get involved, because not only is there a need for more funding in the South, there are actually amazing organizations on the ground who are doing work in LGBT communities. And really what I love about the work that's happening in the South is very often it's intersectional. People are thinking about liberation and justice and equity from the lens of an intersectional lens, thinking about race, class, gender identity, sexual orientation, and really the work is really powerful and inspiring for actually the rest of the country when we look at the LGBT movement in the South as well. So I don't know if Roz wants to chime in a little bit more on that question after I talk a little bit about moving the needle. I think that's a hard question when we think about moving the needle and increasing funding for LGBT communities. We at Funders have been working for many years on that issue with our amazing members. I think that one of the key things that we do as a network, as an affinity group, is to really bring funders together and convene them to have space, to have deeper conversations and strategic conversations about investments and about areas where there are opportunities to fund, where there might not have been funding before. And one of the key things that we do every year is convene a conference called Funding Forward, which happens in the early spring, and next year will be March 30th to April 1st, where funders who are new to LGBT issues and have never funded anything, or funders who've been long-time LGBT funders can come together, can learn together, and can move forward together. Also at that conference, movement leaders who are doing work on LGBT issues, particularly LGBT issues at the intersections very often, or LGBT issues that are very timely and pressing, also attend. So it's a great opportunity to meet groups that maybe might fit your interest area as well.
Perfect. So I definitely know that we have a lot of interest from our participants. So I want to ask Bianca Alston to share with us a few questions. Bianca, can you share some questions for the panelists?
Certainly, Alvin. Thank you again, all the participants, for sending your questions in. The first question is, what opportunities are available to engage collaboratively with universities, especially HBCUs, working to address inequities facing Black LGBTQ communities? And that's for all panelists.
I can jump in to start us off. So there are a couple of different projects that are explicitly engaging HBCUs, particularly around diversity and inclusion, inclusiveness of LGBTQ issues and constituents. One of those projects has been long-standing at the National Black Justice Coalition, which is a national Black LGBTQ-led organization based in Washington, D.C., but working nationally. And they have, probably from the beginning of the organization's existence, worked with HBCUs. The great Black feminist researcher, Dr. Beverly Guy Chaptal, has done a tremendous amount of research in this area and has had a project, I don't know how active it is right now, at the Women's Center at Spelman College. And then the Human Rights Campaign has an HBCU initiative. So those are some potential resources.
Na or Gabriel, would you have any additions to this question?
No, that sounds great.
Yeah, thank you, Ross.
Okay, so the next question is, what are some common pitfalls for philanthropic organizations supporting Black LGBTQ communities, or in hiring and supporting Black LGBTQ people in their own institutions?
Did anyone have any thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, I can jump in and get us started. So I'll start with the first question, and I think my experience, common pitfalls in philanthropy in terms of supporting Black LGBT communities is not really learning, taking the time to learn more specifically and concretely what the communities look like and what their interests and needs are. And I am earlier in my PowerPoint, I lifted up some resources that we helped support that gave us better information on what the concerns, interests, and needs are of Black LGBT communities. And part of the reason why that was work that we felt was very important is because there was a gap in information. And so, you might have often heard the expression of, Black folks need more than marriage equality, Black LGBTQ folks need more than marriage equality, but the rest of that sentence wasn't complete, or at least not, Black LGBT folks knew, but philanthropy didn't know about what those needs were. So just as much as it was information and resource for Black LGBT advocates to use, it was also a tool and for philanthropy to better understand. One of Na's slides really lifted up where support was going to support Black LGBT, where funding was going to support Black LGBTQ communities, and then what those communities actually identified as their most critical issues. And it was really striking to me that the three issues that the data and information and focus grouping shows us, the three core issues are health and wellness, education, and economic security. And those three, but those are also the least funded in terms of Black LGBT community. So that was very striking to me. So asking the questions and really understanding who you're trying to get resources to, that's a common pitfall. That's actually the biggest one. Two, the elephant, it's not the elephant in the room, but the actual existence, of homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia that we all contend with, even if we identify as such, can be an impediment that's often overcome or at least reduced with real interaction and real information. And then I don't know that there's a pitfall in terms of that's specific to sexual orientation and gender identity when it comes to having leadership opportunities in philanthropy. I mean, being a board member of ABFE, that we know that there needs to be more opportunity for Black leadership within the philanthropic sector. But I think that I would say, and obviously I could be wrong, but I would say that the challenges for all people who are themselves not the holders of the dollars to be able to get into these leadership positions. I mean, I think that they're similar, right? There's that you do all the things that you normally would do in any kind of career field. You're networking, you're building your skills, you're seizing all the opportunities that you can to have internships, understand the sector of philanthropy, but that it is also not a field that is growing in the same way as other fields. And so I think that there's always going to be some level of limitation of opportunity. But I know that a pathway to being able to find your way into philanthropy is to seize these kind of leadership opportunities that organizations like that ABFE, Trans Justice Funding Project, and Funders for LGBTQ Issues offers, and then to also participate in some broader networks.
Thank you so much, Roz, for that detailed answer. The person who posed it has also extended that appreciation. The next question is, could we consider the lack of resources to support Black LGBTQ students in pre-K through 12th grade? Is it fair to say that funding streams are adultist, especially given the school-to-prison pipeline?
Bianca, could you repeat the question, please?
I was just going to ask you for that, yeah.
No problem. So the the participant is posing the question, is it fair to say that funding streams to support Black LGBTQ students are adultist, considering the lack of resources to support these communities in schools pre-K through 12?
This is Gabriel. I'm trying to think about an answer for this question, and I'm not actually sure that I have one, but I'm thinking about it.
This is Roz. I'm not as familiar. I mean, I'm very familiar with the funding streams for support for going to school, which I think is what the question is. But the even having a child myself who is in is only in the 4th grade, I'm not as familiar with resources for students who are under the age of 16.
Mm-hmm.
This is not. Similarly, I'm not as familiar with funding under the age of 16. I will switch hats a little bit now and talk about being a board member at the Third Wave Fund, which is a foundation that supports youth-led activism and organizing, very often focused on communities of color and LGBT communities. I think that one of the things that we found and other youth funders sometimes find is that 2 issues. The one is just like making the grant process accessible and doing outreach to LGBT youth groups that are working, and then the other one, which may be more in line with the education piece, is your existing grantees actually having the conversation with them about how they are supporting LGBT students within their work as well. I think a lot of times there aren't those conversations, but it's a wonderful opportunity for funders actually to go back to non-LGBT grantees and to start having conversations about LGBT issues. It can send a very powerful signal to grantees and also help them to be thinking about the communities that they're serving as well.
Okay, thank you, Na, for that. The following question is there a list of recommended groups across the country that you all could suggest for new funders who are looking to identify grantees who want to support the work around LGBTQ, especially Black-led groups in philanthropy?
So this is now one of the things that we do is collect data on grant making for LGBT communities. So if foundations want to reach out to us directly, we're always very happy to provide lists based on issue areas or focus. If you're thinking about inviting grantees, we do that very frequently for foundations, and it can be a helpful resource that we're happy to provide to funders.
This is Gabriel. One of the reasons that I said yes to this call is because I also wanted to share our website as a potential resource for people. So transjusticefundingproject.org. We list out the people who have been grantees since we started, but we also list the people who didn't receive grants but were applicants, because we wanted to make sure that they were named too, because we found their work also honorable even if they weren't a recipient of funds for that year, for that cycle. So, you know, these groups are really small and some of the links might be broken and they might not be in existence anymore, but we keep them up there because we also want to be mapping this work. And then the next month or so we're trying to work on a pretty interactive, several layered map where people can put cursors up on the map and then find different groups, and there might be a sound clip, an audio clip, or a video clip, or a mission statement for the different groups that have applied with us over the past few years, and we're working to build that out. So again, we just invite you to look at that at our website as a potential resource.
Since Gabriel just mentioned the map on his website, our map on lgbtfunders.org that we partner with the Foundation Center to provide provides an interactive map that people can search based on geography, issue area, et cetera, for past grantees who have worked on specific issues. So you can search Black LGBT communities and find groups in your area or issue area that are doing the work that you might be interested in.
I also want to share this resource that was just shared through a comment. It says that another resource for funders looking to invest in collaborative funding opportunities is the LGBTQ Racial Justice Fund, which is an intersectional funding focus in the South, of which the Arcus Foundation happens to be a member. I just wanted to share that also. Go ahead.
Thanks, Bianca. I just want to add to that. So the LGBT Racial Justice Fund, our current focus is on the Southeast U.S., so on the South, where we have a cohort of grantees. The fund was co-founded with the Arcus Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and an anonymous donor. It is a great example of organizations working to support LGBTQ communities of color with, obviously a significant amount of that support going to Black LGBTQ communities, and really being able to support existing work that's meant to change the social and economic realities for those communities. And I just want to take this slight little panelist privilege in sharing that I think that, we probably are seeing shrinking support post-marriage equality for issues that are not marriage equality. But that has, for the Arcus Foundation and all of the other funders on this call, including NAH representing a network of funders, there are still many of us who have seen the issues impacting Black LGBT communities as much broader than that. And one of the places where I think that we see a lot of promise, even with LGBTQ specific dollars themselves shrinking in terms of targeting communities of color and Black communities of color, is a much more open set of tables to engage, where funders like Arcus that have a focus on LGBTQ issues can collaborate with other funders who share our interest in these core social justice issues. So whether it's the Just Fair Schools Fund, which is addressing school-to-prison pipeline issues, as a table that we're around, or being members of ABFE, and being connected to an emerging funders table looking at supporting thriving Black communities, that there are opportunities to engage in these other tables and not just tables that isolate LGBT communities and issues. That's promising.
Hello? Hello? Yes, speaking?
Oh, this is Ernest Hopkins. Was I finally able to get through?
Yes, Ernest, we can hear you now.
Oh wow, I'm glad to finally be able to participate, but I'm sad that I was unable to speak in the Q&A section. But thank you very much, Ed, for giving me a number that I could actually be heard on. So I just want to take these last few moments to give a bit of my conversation with you about the work that we're doing with young Black gay men. First of all, thank you to Third Wave and to ABFE for the webinar, and thank you for the opportunity to really talk from a health space about the really resilient and exciting work that we're doing with young Black gay men, specifically around HIV issues, but in a broader health care context. The San Francisco AIDS Foundation has long been focused on a broad perspective of, as a large regional and local organization, a much broader perspective on HIV to end the epidemic and to eliminate the human suffering caused by HIV. And that's been the work that we've done since our inception. But back in 2005, it became quite clear with some MMWR data from the CDC, which actually showed that in a very large study that they did in 5 cities across the country, that black gay men were disproportionately impacted across the board. 46% of the men in the study were infected, and 68% of that 48% of that 46% didn't even know that they were at risk for HIV. It becomes really clear to us when we think about social justice issues in a black gay context that if such a significant percentage of our population is living with a chronic disease, and only chronic if they get the proper health care access and medication available to make it chronic. Only in that instance can these young black gay men have an opportunity to live a successful life and thrive in our society. And so for us, it became critically important to actually hone down and begin to focus on issues of health for this population, both physical and mental health. Our first issue was to try to identify what was currently being done for the population because it wasn't clear that the government had good data to provide us information on what actually was occurring. And so I was excited to see Na's slide that showed that currently we are finally reaping some of the success of the very diligent efforts that we've been making over this last 10 years to try to, first of all, heighten the profile of the disparities in the black gay community from a health care perspective, and actually signal to the government that while we did not know the extent of our disparity, we also understood that there was insufficient work being done in the community to address the healthcare needs of the population. And we work very diligently with folks saying, first, we're not asking for additional resources yet. We want to know what you're doing with the resources that are currently available. And to the extent that they are being provided across the board to our population based on our percentage of the epidemic, we don't necessarily need additional resources, we just need a redirection. And I think that with the advent of the Obama administration and the use of the National HIV/AIDS strategy, we finally began to make progress in actually redirecting resources to the population such that now we have successfully had several funding opportunities across various divisions of HHS, both NIH, at the Centers for Disease Control, and for the Health Resources and Services Administration that provides care and treatment for HIV. We've been successful in getting resources targeted to the population in each instance in ways that we certainly didn't expect to in the past. And so now we're looking to serve this population of young black gay men in a very different way. Now that the resources for their care are at hand, it's really now important to support them in their leadership development across the country. We have created a Young Black Gay Leadership Institute that provides a summit every year. But what we know is that the summit is not sufficient. They need ongoing and additional support in regional ways that allow them to form the networks of support that are so important to heightening your success in life. We know that they need assistance in self-assessment and getting back into school and job training. And I also noted the dearth of resources to education. This school to prison pipeline that's been discussed so clearly prior to this is also part of the work of these men. We found in a recent study at NIH that 61% of the black gay men in the study had been incarcerated. And I think that for many of us, that was a wake-up call to spend a lot more attention on the issues of the prison the education to prison pipeline. We also have, obviously, the additional concern around HIV criminalization. Just by living their lives in a normal way, many of the men in our community are at significant risk for being locked up solely because they're living with HIV. And so that becomes another issue that we've begun to address at the National Black Gay Men's Advocacy Coalition and also in the YBGLI, because we believe that, you know, if you can't really support a person in their health, how can they possibly be successfully supported in other parts of their life? And finally, I think this synergy that we're beginning to achieve between Black health and LGBT health, the synergy that we're beginning to achieve between LGBT issues and Black issues is really an exciting development. I've been in both LGBT spaces and health spaces for a very long time, and I can tell you that they're frequently separate. And so seeing things synergize in an appropriate way now, where we're actually beginning to reap some of the benefits of some of the advocacy that's been done over the last 10 years, is very exciting. And the funders out there who are supporting us, first of all, thank you. The ones that have not gotten into the space yet, I would agree with Roz that targeted leadership development and education, targeted self-efficacy training around advocacy for issues in their local communities, work to develop community that's frequently not available, is some of the most important investment that can be made. We have found that with the heightening of awareness and with the heightening of profile of these young men, they begin to have a self-efficacy and a desire to improve their health, which actually has made a significant difference in the way that they walk in the world. And so those are some of the most important things I think that funders can do, and I hope that we will see more investment in the future in that work. So I'm very happy I was able to get on finally, and sorry for the delay.
Ernest, thank you for actually jumping on. I think that was a wonderful presentation. Next slide. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So next slide, please. We've come to the end of this particular conversation, but we want to end with something that I think is very important as we walk away, and it's a quote from James Baldwin. "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." I think those are really important words for us as funders and also supporters to understand that there is a huge opportunity, need, and I would dare say a responsibility around supporting Black LGBTQ activism. Regardless where we are, I think it really is an opportune moment, probably more so than ever before. So I hope that we can actually continue this conversation both with ABFE, with funders, with WAVE, who have actually brought a very significant conversation together. Next slide. So I know our next steps are really around moving forward. I just also want to let folks know that ABFE is actually hosting a national conference in Baltimore. I want to say, is it April of next year? I don't have the date.
April 7th through 9th.
April 7th through 9th. And they're also accepting proposals. And I'm just wondering, given the richness of this conversation, what a face-to-face workshop could really be, and really kind of connecting people in the face-to-face real time. So again, I want to say thank you to the presenters, Roz, Gabriel, Na, and Ernest. And now I want to turn it over to our friends at ABFE. Edward, are you there?
I am. Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone that took the time out of their day to be part of this, and for those speakers you just mentioned who have been in this work for a long, long time, and who have taken some time out to really enlighten each and every one of us around really supporting justice for everyone and not being selective in a space and in a particular political time where some people are being forced and very focused on trying to separate us. This was really one of those other moments for us to understand how we need to really focus on uniting and being unapologetic around supporting all lives, all Black lives. As Alvin mentioned, we do have our conference from April 7th through 9th in Baltimore, another very important place for us as a people and in history and in this moment in time. The call for sessions is now open. It is open until November 25th, and so if you're following the Twitter handle Blackout Philanthropy or ABFE, you will see links to the site. If you go to abfe.org, it should take you right to something you can click on and actually complete an idea. We want to hear from you. Here's some session suggestions so that we might be able to really lift up and continue conversations that are important to all of us. Please continue to follow. Stay tuned. You will get a survey electronically, and we invite you to complete that survey so that we can better support you and create the right programming as part of this third Thursday series that we have been doing for the past year and a half or so. Always feel free to reach out to us at ABFE. Thank you again to the team that's on this call. Alvin, thank you for your support and leadership in this space. And we hope that everyone continues to thrive and support one another each and every day.